It was supposed to be just another glitzy night in Hollywood. The Dolby Theater shimmered under lights, celebrities glided across the red carpet, and laughter echoed through the hall. It was the Liberty and Laughter Charity Gala, where politics, pop culture, and press collided for an evening of humor, fundraising, and light jabs. Chris Rock had been chosen as the headline act. Sharp-tongued, fearless, and always ready to stir things up, he had the crowd in the palm of his hand within minutes. Until he didn't. 10 minutes into his set, he leaned in toward the mic with a signature grin. "You know, I thought we weren't allowed to joke about Barron Trump. But come on, have you seen that kid lately? Looks like he's running the country from Minecraft." Laughter, scattered at first, then a few louder chuckles. But it wasn't unanimous, because in the fourth row, Karoline Leavitt froze. She was there not as a politician, not as a former White House press secretary, but as a guest. Quiet, unassuming. Until that moment. Chris didn't stop. "I mean, I know the Trumps like to build walls, but I didn't know they were raising robots, too." More laughter. Some gasps. Karoline's jaw tightened. Her fingers wrapped around the base of her wine glass, but she didn't drink. She looked over at the stage, unblinking. Chris moved on with his routine. Or at least, he tried to. Because what he didn't see, what the cameras didn't catch just yet, was Karoline slowly standing up. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't shouting. She was just walking. Straight toward the edge of the stage. A staff member in a headset whispered, "Is that Karoline Leavitt?" The producer in the booth leaned forward. "What the hell is she doing?" Karoline reached the stairs by the stage, heels clicking like a countdown. Chris, oblivious, tossed in one more line. "Barron's the only Trump I trust to run my Wi-Fi." And that's when Karoline took the mic. Uninvited. Unannounced. The crowd fell silent. Chris turned, confused. "Whoa, this part of the bit?" Karoline's eyes were locked on him, and when she spoke, the whole room leaned in. Karoline didn't scream. She didn't need to. She stood center stage, holding the mic that Chris Rock had just dropped into her hand. Half joking, half confused, expecting maybe a punchline. What he got instead was a reckoning. Karoline turned to the crowd, actors, anchors, influencers, senators. Then she turned back to Chris. Her voice was calm, measured, deadly. "You think mocking a teenager is edgy or brave?" Chris blinked. "Hey, it's just jokes, you know, comedy?" Karoline tilted her head slightly, her lips tightening. "No, Chris. Comedy is about timing, truth, and relevance. But taking shots at a kid who's never stood at a podium, never spoken on a campaign trail, never asked for the spotlight?" She looked down at the mic in her hand. "That's not comedy. That's cowardice, dressed in a punchline." The room shifted. What had been a night of light-hearted roasts now felt like a courtroom under cross-examination. Karoline didn't stop. "Barron Trump is 18. He didn't choose the name. He didn't choose the spotlight. But you chose this stage. And you chose to drag a kid through your monologue like he's public property." Chris tried to cut in. Okay, relax. It was a joke about Minecraft, not—" "Say that to his face," Karoline cut sharply. "Would you?" Chris paused. No answer. Karoline stepped forward, no longer speaking just to him, but to the audience. "We talk a lot about decency, about empathy, about being better. But the minute someone we don't vote for has a child, we treat them like they're open season for ridicule, like they don't deserve what we demand for our own kids." Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Even a few celebrities lowered their phones. Karoline scanned the room. "You all laughed, and maybe you think that makes you brave. But sometimes not laughing. That's the brave part. The silence was deafening. Chris Rock slowly stepped back. It wasn't his stage anymore. It belonged to the woman who didn't raise her voice, just her standards. Karoline didn't slam the mic. She didn't storm off. She simply paused, met Chris Rock's eyes with a long, piercing look, and handed the mic back to the host like it burned her palm. Then she turned and walked off stage. No music, no applause, just whispers, and then phones, hundreds of them. The clip hit Twitter before she reached her seat. Backstage, the event coordinator panicked. She hijacked the stage. No, the producer said, eyes wide as he watched the footage. She owned it. Across the internet, the moment exploded. The caption that spread fastest? She didn't yell. She didn't curse. She ended him. By the time Karoline reached the lobby, the first headlines were already going live. Karoline Leavitt silences Chris Rock in live takedown. Defends Barron Trump without raising her voice. Mic drop of the year. Political fire meets comedy line. News anchors scrambled. Clips flooded TikTok. Even people who didn't know who Karoline was now did. Meanwhile, inside the gala, Chris Rock tried to recover. So, yeah, I guess that joke didn't land, he said, forcing a grin. Polite laughter, uneasy. Because no matter how seasoned you are, you don't bounce back fast from being morally outclassed on your own stage. Outside, a reporter caught up with Karoline. Ms. Leavitt, what made you walk up there? She looked him straight in the eye. There's a difference between being bold and being cruel. Tonight, someone crossed that line. I just made sure they knew it. And with that, she stepped into a black SUV and was gone. But the moment? That stayed behind. Burned into memory. By midnight, Twitter was on fire. Karoline Leavitt, Barron defense, mic drop, all trending, all within hours. Clips of her calm, scalpel-sharp words racked up millions of views. Not just from conservatives, but from parents, teachers, and everyday people tired of kids becoming the punchline. A single tweet captured the mood perfectly. Say what you want about her politics. But tonight, Karoline Leavitt stood for something that goes beyond parties. She stood for respect. Even comedians began weighing in. Some defended Chris, it was just a joke. But others weren't so sure. One famous late-night host tweeted, "Note to self, leave kids out of it. Not worth getting verbally assassinated on stage." At Fox News, a special segment ran within the hour. Karoline Leavitt, the new face of conservative courage? And even CNN, usually critical, admitted she handled it better than most would have, with restraint, precision, and power. But not everyone applauded. A few progressive accounts tried to spin it. She used Barron to make herself look good. This was calculated outrage, but those voices were drowned out by people posting, "Finally, someone drew a line." You don't need to like Trump to know that mocking a teenager is low. Back at her apartment, Karoline sat by the window. Her phone was buzzing nonstop. Texts from senators, activists, even old college classmates she hadn't spoken to in years. One simply said, "You made us proud tonight." Not politically, personally. Nicholas, her husband, handed her tea. "You okay?" he asked gently. Karoline nodded. "Yeah, just didn't expect all this." He sat beside her. "You didn't plan it, but you meant it. That's what people see." She looked down at her phone, paused at a message from someone unexpected. That took guts. Respect. Chelsea Clinton. Karoline raised her brows. Wow. In a press room across town, Chris Rock's manager fielded calls. "Do we issue an apology?" Chris didn't answer. He just stared at the replay. Karoline's stare, her words, the crowd going silent. He scratched his chin. I've been heckled. I've been booed. But I've never been outclassed like that. He leaned back, and for the first time in a long time he wasn't sure if he'd gone too far, or if someone had finally gone far enough to stop him. The next morning, Karoline stepped into the bright lights of a national morning show studio. She hadn't slept much. The clip had gone viral in over 40 countries. People she didn't even know were calling her the Ice Blade in Heels. But Karoline wasn't here to bask. She was here to explain, without apologizing. The anchor smiled as the cameras rolled. Karoline Leavitt, thank you for joining us. Quite a night last evening, wasn't it? Karoline nodded, composed. I didn't plan to speak, but I couldn't stay silent either. The anchor leaned in. Some say you hijacked a comedy show to score political points, that you used Barron Trump for your own spotlight. Your response? Karoline didn't flinch. I didn't speak because of politics. I spoke because there's a line you don't cross, especially when the person you're targeting can't fight back. The anchor pressed on. But surely you agree, public figures, even their families, are open to commentary? Karoline's eyes narrowed, not with anger, but clarity. Commentary? Maybe. But cheap shots at a kid who never asked to be in the game? That's not commentary. That's cowardice hiding behind a laugh track. The studio fell silent for half a beat. Even the anchor hesitated. She wasn't used to guests turning questions into statements that silenced the room. After the break, the tone shifted. Viewers flooded the station's text line with support. Finally, someone said what we're all thinking. She didn't yell. She didn't whine. She just ended him. The anchor looked back at Karoline, this time with curiosity. You've become a symbol overnight. Some are calling you the anti-heckler. Others say you're the future of Republican messaging. Does that pressure you? Karoline let out a quiet breath. I didn't ask for any of this, but if defending decency means carrying that weight, then so be it. She stood as the segment wrapped, shook the anchor's hand, and walked off stage with the poise of someone who didn't come for applause, just clarity. Across the country, clips of the interview went viral again. Not because she said anything new, but because she meant every word. And people knew it. Even those who didn't like her politics couldn't ignore her presence. Backstage, a producer whispered to another, "You know what's wild? She never even raised her voice." "She didn't have to," the other replied. "She already raised the bar." Chris Rock sat alone in the green room of a late-night studio in New York, flipping through cue cards. His team had prepped a carefully worded statement. Something safe. Something clever. "Hey, I make jokes. If one goes too far, I own it. But I don't apologize for doing what I do." That was the plan. Until there was a knock at the door. He looked up. "Yeah?" The door opened slightly. A stage assistant peeked in. "Chris, someone's here to see you. She didn't make an appointment." Chris frowned. Then the door opened fully, and in walked Ivanka Trump. Chris froze. "I didn't know you were here," he said, standing up awkwardly. Ivanka smiled politely, but her eyes were sharp. "I didn't come to make a scene, Chris. I came to tell you what your joke did." Chris shifted. "Look, I didn't mean—" She cut him off, still calm. "You didn't mean for millions of people to mock my little brother? You didn't mean for his face to be plastered across the internet with punchlines he'll have to carry the rest of his life?" Chris sighed. "It was about the family. I do that with everyone. You know that." Ivanka stepped closer. "Do you do it with their children?" Chris didn't answer. She handed him a printed tweet. It was from a 17-year-old in Florida. I used to get bullied because of my last name, too. Watching Karoline stand up to Chris Rock made me believe someone would defend me. Finally. Chris read it, then read it again. Ivanka added softly, "You didn't just make a joke. You made a ripple. You turned a teenager into a target." She turned to leave. At the door, she looked back. "You can try to spin it tonight. But if you do, remember, you're not just facing critics. You're facing people who finally saw decency speak louder than the laugh track." She walked out without another word. Chris stood still, cue cards in hand. He looked down at the script, then tossed it into the trash. Minutes later, on air, Chris sat across from the host. He looked directly into the camera and said, "Last night, I made a joke about Barron Trump. And it wasn't just a bad joke. It was the wrong target. Karoline Leavitt called me out, and honestly, she was right." The audience didn't know whether to clap or stay silent. But Karoline, watching from her apartment, said nothing. She just leaned back, sipped her tea, and whispered to herself, "Some lessons don't need yelling. They just need to be heard." By morning, Karoline's inbox was overflowing. Not just from journalists or politicians, but from students, mothers, fathers, and even former critics. "I've never voted red in my life, but last night you made me stand up in my living room. My daughter rewound your clip 5 times. She said, 'That's how I want to speak one day.' Thank you for proving strength doesn't have to scream." Even conservative leaders were stunned, not by the popularity, but by the tone. Karoline hadn't ranted. She hadn't polarized. She'd protected. And that made her untouchable, even in circles that once dismissed her as too polished or too young. On college campuses, debate teams were analyzing her speech. Communication professors used her monologue as a masterclass in rhetorical control. And in Washington, donors began whispering one question behind closed doors: is she the future? At Fox, one host said it openly: "We've seen firebrands, we've seen fighters. But Karoline Leavitt may be something else entirely, a force of precision." But Karoline? She was still sitting at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. Nicholas walked in, coffee in hand. "They're saying you might be asked to run in 2026, he said, smirking. She raised an eyebrow. "For what? National office or next roast survivor?" He chuckled. "You didn't just win a moment, Karoline. You reminded people why words still matter." That afternoon, she was invited to speak at a youth leadership summit in Texas. The theme? How to speak truth without losing grace. Karoline hesitated. "Should I?" Nicholas nodded. "Why not? You've already done it. Now teach them how." On stage in Dallas, she stood before 2,000 students. No notes, no podium, just her voice. You don't have to raise your volume to be powerful. Sometimes raising your standards is enough. And if someone ever mocks what you love or who you protect, don't explode. Stand. Speak. Then step away. Because real strength doesn't cling to the microphone. It leaves echoes. The auditorium erupted. But Karoline didn't smile wide. She just gave a small nod and walked off stage, knowing this was no longer about a single night. It was a beginning. It was nearly midnight when Karoline's phone rang. Not a text, not a DM, an actual phone call from a Washington area code. She hesitated, then picked up. "Ms. Leavitt, this is Deputy Chief Langston from the Office of Public Engagement. The First Lady would like to meet. Privately. Tomorrow." Karoline blinked. "Dr. Biden?" A pause. No, Langston replied. Melania. The next afternoon, Karoline stepped into a discreet suite at the Hay Adams Hotel. Melania Trump stood by the window, serene, composed, not a camera in sight. You said something I could not, Melania said softly, and people listened. Karoline was silent. She didn't know what this was. A thank you? A warning? A test? Melania continued. They mocked my son for years. Late-night hosts, comedians, journalists. I stayed quiet. Not because I was weak, but because I didn't think anyone would defend him. She turned to Karoline. But you did. Karoline exhaled slowly. I didn't plan to. I just couldn't sit there. Melania nodded. That instinct, keep it. But know this, when you stand up once, people will expect you to keep standing, even when you're tired, even when it's messy. She walked closer and gently took Karoline's hand. So, I ask you, not to stop now. Karoline's brow furrowed. Stop what? Melania smiled faintly. They'll ask you to run soon. Not just your team, the party. They've been waiting for someone who can speak without spitting fire. Someone who makes sense, not noise. Karoline laughed once, quietly. I'm not a candidate. Melania's gaze sharpened. You weren't a speaker either. Until you spoke. You weren't a protector. Until you protected. She stepped back, the meeting clearly over. Think about what you've started. And with that, she left Karoline standing alone in the suite. Not with power, but with possibility. That night, Karoline stood by the window of her apartment, staring at the Capitol lights in the distance. Nicholas walked up, slipping an arm around her waist. What did she say? He asked softly. Karoline didn't answer right away. Then finally, she asked me if I'm ready to keep standing. Nicholas nodded, understanding. You are. She gave a faint smile. Then I guess I need to find the right shoes. 1 month later, Karoline stepped onto the stage of the American Civic Forum, a bipartisan conference known for hard questions, hot lights, and viral moments. The theme? Words that shape nations. She wasn't the keynote. Not yet. She was one of many speakers lined up to share thoughts on public discourse in the digital age. But everyone in the room knew. Her turn was the one they were waiting for. Backstage, a familiar voice echoed in the corridor. Well, well, if it isn't the microphone assassin herself. Karoline turned. Chris Rock stood by the catering table, holding a coffee cup like a shield. He wasn't grinning, not mocking, just searching. Karoline raised an eyebrow. No opening jokes? Chris smirked faintly. I've learned to pause before the punchline. They stood in silence for a beat. Then he said it. You did what I couldn't. You got people to listen without a laugh track. Karoline nodded, arms crossed. I didn't need laughs. I just needed them to feel something real. Chris looked down. I rewatched that night 100 times, and every time I flinched less. Not because it hurt less, but because I started to get it. She tilted her head. Started? He nodded. I'm a comic, Karoline. We're wired to poke, to test. But when I saw the way people looked at you, not as a political figure, but as a shield, I realized maybe not everything has to be a punchline. Karoline stepped closer. You can still be funny without punching down. Chris looked up. I'm trying. One show at a time. That evening, when Karoline took the stage, she glanced briefly at Chris in the front row. He gave a quiet nod, and she began. Words are currency. And lately, we've been spending too much on sarcasm, and too little on sincerity. She paced slowly. I didn't come here to fight. I came to remind that every time you speak, you're shaping someone's belief about what's normal, what's fair, and what's forgivable. Last month, I walked onto a stage I wasn't invited to. I interrupted. I made noise. But today, I was invited to this stage because sometimes one voice, when it speaks for the right reason, can change the room. The applause was real, not viral, not forced. Chris Rock stood and clapped. This time, not silenced, but maybe evolved. The morning after the American Civic Forum, the headlines weren't about ratings. They were about respect. Karoline Leavitt, from walk-on to game-changer. Chris Rock applauds her message. A new era for public discourse? One woman, one voice, a national reset. Across the country, classrooms played her speech. Professors quoted her lines. High school debate clubs turned her into a case study. Even brand campaigns started echoing her message. Use your voice, but use it wisely. Karoline returned to Washington, greeted not with fanfare, but purpose. She was invited to private meetings with lawmakers, civic leaders, and education officials. They weren't asking her to run. They were asking her to teach, to mentor young speakers, to advise on messaging, to shape how the next generation would speak truth with strength and restraint. 1 week later, she received a handwritten note delivered by courier. No signature, just a quote inside. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the voice that says, I'll speak up anyway. At the bottom, you reminded us. Karoline folded it carefully, set it in her drawer. That night, she and Nicholas sat on their apartment balcony, watching the lights of the Capitol flicker. He leaned over. You ever think this all started because of one bad joke? She smiled. It started because I didn't let the joke end the moment. He nodded, raising his glass. To the moment, that became more. They clinked glasses. The next day, Chris Rock stood on stage again. Different crowd, different coast. He made them laugh. He made them think. And when someone in the audience heckled a political figure's daughter, he paused. Then said, That's not how we do things anymore. The room quieted, and somewhere, watching on a screen backstage, Karoline smiled. Not because she'd won, but because something finally changed. Some moments are born from chaos, others from clarity. Karoline didn't plan to take the stage. She didn't walk in seeking applause. But when a line was crossed, she stood, not with fury, but with focus. And in doing so, she reminded a nation that dignity isn't partisan. It isn't loud. It's simply right. When Chris Rock made a joke, he expected a laugh. What he got was a legacy. A moment where words mattered again. Where grace wasn't weakness. It was power. So ask yourself, when the moment comes, will you stay seated? Or will you stand like Karoline? And let your voice echo for those who can't. Thanks for watching Surprising Stories. If this moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, one sentence can silence a room and spark a movement.